And I remember going into this house and going up these steps into this really dark attic. It had wood floors. I can visualize it. And she had all these newspapers on the floor. And I laid down on the newspapers, and she inserted what I now know is a catheter tube and said, "Okay, you're done." And I got dressed and left.
Almost 60 years later, Nancy Cooper Berkman recalls that day in 1967 and how she ended up lying on newspapers in a stranger's attic.
It goes to my marriage to my first husband. He was an abuser, a drunken abuser. I mean, he tried to kill me, kidnap, all that kind of stuff. So I finally got away from him, and I finally came back to Pittsburgh, late 67, 68, with a baby, my 2.5, 3-year-old daughter, and found out I was pregnant, which was the last thing I wanted or needed at that point in time. A family friend of my dad's who happens to be a criminal, I reached out to him to help me do something about it, which is when I found out about abortions. He set me up, it was $100, and with an older lady in East Liberty. That day and overnight, I started to bleed really bad. So they ended up calling an ambulance. Fortunately, I didn't die, because I came very close to dying and bleeding to death.
In 1967, another Pennsylvania woman was leaving her small town, headed to Boston University. At the time, she didn't know she would spend her life advocating for women, but one tragic event changed her life.
But abortion was still illegal, and I was a counselor at BU, and I got a call from one of the women on my floor. And she said, "I'm over at blank hotel, and so-and-so just had an abortion, and she's bleeding heavily. Can you help?" Well, by the time I got there, she was dead. So that was a real impetus for me to be active.
Jean Clark would later become director of the Allegheny Women's Center and provide safe, legal abortions.
My sister-in-law told me the story of, she was in a bad first marriage, and she had a small child, and she discovered that she was pregnant by her abusive husband. She met her abortionist at a motel on Route 79, Interstate 79. And the first thing he did was rape her. And she said, "Why are you doing this?" And he said, "It's part of my technique to relax you." That rape story was very common. So the women were at such risk.
In the 1960s, Nancy Klein saw firsthand how women were treated when they came to the hospital after an illegal abortion.
At that time, there was at least one male physician who, if and when a woman would come in and he suspected that she had induced an abortion for whatever way, mechanically, poison or whatever, if the woman's intake papers showed that she was Catholic, he would call a priest and give this woman last rites. I'm sure it was not hospital policy, but it was just his little way of demeaning women.
Fast forward 40 years. Jessica Semler, a reproductive rights advocate, speaks openly about her legal abortion, and it was a very different experience from Nancy's.
The clinic was very clean. Every single person that I encountered, from the security guard, which unfortunately Planned Parenthood has to have, to every person at the front desk, to the doctor, to the person that comes in before the doctor, I felt so completely supported and affirmed.
Abortion wasn't always illegal or politicized. Until the mid-1800s, abortion was a common and accepted practice in the United States.
In English common law, abortions were legal before something called quickening, which is when a woman felt a fetus move somewhere between the 4th and 6th month of pregnancy. And all abortions before that were legal, and only after that were they illegal.
Abortion drugs were openly sold. There were even advertisements for abortion services in newspapers. Midwives provided most of the reproductive health care.
There were only proprietary medical schools, so you bought your way in. But these doctors needed a way to force people to come to them.
In 1847, a group of men formed the American Medical Association. They pushed for laws making abortion illegal in order to put midwives out of business and take control of the highly profitable business of childbirth. By 1880, all states had laws restricting abortion. Criminalizing abortion sent the practice underground, resulting in the death of thousands of women. Death wasn't the only result of an illegal abortion. Thousands of women were treated for complications. Many women were left infertile. In the 1960s, women began demanding equality. It may be hard to believe now, but it was illegal for a single woman to get birth control pills until 1972. And until 1978, women could be fired just for being pregnant. As the women's liberation movement gained traction, reproductive rights took center stage, and Americans' attitudes about abortion began to shift. One woman's abortion story struck a nerve with Americans. 29-year-old Sherry Finkbein was the host of the popular 1960s TV show Romper Room. The mother of 4 feared her fetus was damaged after taking the drug thalidomide for morning sickness. The drug was known to cause severe birth defects. Her doctor recommended an abortion and arranged for Finkbein to have one at a Utah hospital. Reporters found out, and when the story exploded, the hospital refused to go ahead with the procedure. With abortion illegal in every state, Finkbein was forced to go to Sweden for the abortion. Doctors there confirmed her fetus was severely deformed. Her ordeal wasn't over. When she returned home, she found out she had been fired from her job.
Then we heard that somebody else was now doing Romper Room and that they would keep her on doing it. I was told, and I remember the words exactly, that they felt I was unfit to handle children.
A Gallup poll at the time found 52% of Americans thought Finkbein made the right decision. Women with means traveled to other countries for abortions or found a friendly doctor willing to perform one for a fee.
Of course, if you were a upper middle class woman and you had your obstetrician in the area and whoops, you found out there was a whoops going on and you were in the OR very quickly, and the doctor would say to the surrounding people, what you're seeing here is a D&C, and it would be all over with. And that's how it always is. It's the people who can afford it the least who have to suffer.
Women began organizing and advocating to legalize abortion.
This is Jane.
We had the phone numbers on bulletin boards around Chicago. Pregnant, call Jane.
In 1969, Heather Booth founded the Jane Service while helping a friend find an abortion.
I made some calls and contacts and located a physician who was willing to perform an abortion. Word of that had spread, and someone else contacted me. And then several months later, word had spread again and someone else contacted me. And I set up what became known as the service, or Jane.
Between 1969 and 1973, the Jane Service performed 11,000 abortions.
Good evening. In a landmark ruling, the Supreme Court today legalized abortions. The majority in cases from Texas and Georgia said that the decision to end a pregnancy during the first 3 months belongs to the woman and her doctor, not the government.
The landmark 1973 decision in Roe v. Wade made abortion legal in all states. While pro-choice advocates celebrated, the anti-choice forces began a decades-long crusade to bring Roe down, a battle many did not see coming.
I was born post Roe v. Wade, so I have never experienced anything different. I've always had choice. When there were rumblings, whenever the Supreme Court new justices were being elected, I started to be concerned, but I would talk to a lot of people that are my age that have known nothing different, and they thought for sure there's no way that Roe v. Wade could be overturned.
We were doing our thing, the other half was doing theirs. Quietly, slowly, surely, little by little, chipping away.
The first sign that the anti-abortion side was not giving up came in 1974. Thousands showed up for the first March for Life in Washington, D.C. The march route went right by the Supreme Court, leaving no doubt what they had set their sights on. Anti-choice activists began protesting outside abortion clinics, harassing women trying to get inside. Clinics were forced to provide patient escorts and later went to court to establish buffer zones around the clinics. In Allegheny County, protesters must stay 15 feet away from clinic entrances.
Abortion that isn't safe, legal, affordable, and accessible for every single person who wants one isn't safe for any of us.
Laura Horowitz has been a patient escort for 30 years, helping hundreds of women safely into Pittsburgh clinics.
We would get 200-300 people on a Saturday downtown, and patients were terrified. They would scream at the women, try to shame them, call them names, threaten them, your boyfriend's going to break up with you, you'll never be able to have another baby.
By 1985, anti-choice activists were becoming increasingly violent.
There were incidents of property damage. They blockaded clinics. There was a thing that happened where they drove a car up to the door of the East Liberty Clinic, chained themselves to the door, and then put the chain around the car.
The violence became personal for Jean Clark, who was director of the Allegheny Women's Center at the time.
My house was firebombed and my son was shot at. Thank God they were on the floor in front of the TV playing Space Invaders, so the bullet went over their head.
Over time, we have watched antis get smarter about the way that they operate. They can stand outside clinics every day, all day, for years, and it doesn't interfere with abortion rights as much as getting legislation. And they have gotten very smart about that.
The anti-choice groups are well funded. They challenged Roe in court any chance they could and worked to get conservative judges appointed to the bench. At the same time, they were working closely with state legislators to craft bills limiting abortion access. One of their first successes was the passage of the 1976 Hyde Amendment, which banned federal funding to pay for abortions. In 1992, the Supreme Court heard the case Planned Parenthood v. Casey. And in a somewhat confusing ruling, the court upheld most of the provisions in the Pennsylvania Abortion Control Act. And while it reaffirmed a woman's right to an abortion, the court also broadened the state's authority to regulate it. Catherine Colbert argued the case before the Supreme Court.
But the Casey decision went a little further, and it permitted states to enact barriers to abortion as long as they weren't undue burdens on women. And as a result, in the following 3 decades, we've seen states pass hundreds of restrictions on abortion, and the increasingly conservative courts uphold those restrictions.
The Pennsylvania Abortion Control Act requires doctors to read a state-produced script to patients about possible risks from abortion.
I had to go onto a telehealth call the week of to listen to all of the risks associated with abortion. And even at that time, I knew that a lot of it was not true. It was so wild because this was a medical procedure, and from the very jump, it's like, no, I'm in a political process that I have no choice but to be in.
The beginning of the end for Roe began in 2021, when the Supreme Court agreed to hear the Dobbs v. Jackson case. is centered around a Mississippi ban on abortions at 15 weeks. In June 2022, the Supreme Court announced its ruling.
We're outside the Supreme Court after the landmark decision that overturned Roe v. Wade.
This triggered a wave of abortion bans and restrictions across the country. For women who need an abortion, staying in their home state could have deadly consequences. Megan was 20 weeks into her pregnancy when she was told her baby wouldn't survive, and she was at risk for deadly consequences. At the time, abortions were banned in Wisconsin. Megan was forced to go to Minnesota for the life-saving procedure.
Termination of pregnancy is only allowed for life of the mother, and that requires 3 doctors to all agree that it is okay to perform life-saving care in ending their pregnancy. Imagine if you went to the emergency room with a gunshot wound and you needed 3 doctors to approve care for you before it was allowed to be administered.
At 12 weeks, Jen found out her baby had little chance of surviving. At the time, Idaho's abortion ban had no exceptions for fetal anomalies. She and her husband had to leave Idaho for a state where Jen could get the health care she needed.
I had to drive 6 hours away. Couldn't be with my family, couldn't be with my friends. It was trauma on tragedy.
You know, being a parent impacts every aspect of our life. And so we can't just allow the government to have authority over one aspect, because it's not really one aspect. It bleeds into every aspect of our life.
While these women all wanted to be pregnant, many women don't, and they say it's time to stop being shamed about their decision.
If a person is pregnant and doesn't want to be pregnant, I believe they deserve an abortion. I don't believe they owe anyone an explanation.
Now we're finally getting to the point where we're not going to be ashamed anymore. We're not going to hide. We're not going to apologize. And we're sure as hell not going to try and explain to men who can't get pregnant why we need abortion.
You do not control your life if you do not control reproduction.
Sarah Dixon of Planned Parenthood Pennsylvania Advocates and PAC says after the Dobbs decision, the Pittsburgh Clinic has become a destination for many women from out of state.
It has increased quite dramatically. Previously, it used to be around 19% of our abortion patients were from outside of the state. Post-Dobbs, we are looking at about 25% now.
The influx of women has meant increased wait time for the procedure. While abortion is legal in Pennsylvania, it is not accessible. There are only 17 clinics in Pennsylvania that perform medical and surgical abortions, and only 2 of them are west of Harrisburg. Why so few clinics? One reason is the Ambulatory Surgical Requirements Act, which classifies abortion clinics as surgical centers.
And in that requirement, there are several facilities regulations, including like specialized elevators, flooring, very specialized HVAC system. It even dictates how wide the hallways are.
These non-medical requirements force many clinics to close because they just couldn't afford the expensive renovations needed. These kind of laws are known as TRAP laws, Targeted Regulation of Abortion Providers. This January, Pennsylvania House Democrats introduced a bill that would repeal the law.
These are, make no doubt, restrictions that no other outpatient medical facilities have to have.
The end of Roe is not the end of the anti-choice fight. Leaders of the movement aren't done yet.
Good morning, this is Gal Ruzicka at K-Talk
Gal
Radio.
Ruzicka, a right-wing activist, worked closely with Phyllis Schlafly, and for the last 50 years she has worked tirelessly to overturn Roe.
We're not through fighting because the other side will continue to try to make abortion legal.
The right has set their sights on the abortion pill mifepristone. The drug is used in medication abortions, which now account for 53% of all abortions in the United States. Mifepristone has been used in Europe for decades and was approved by the FDA in 2000. Despite studies showing it is safe and extremely effective, a group of anti-abortion doctors filed a lawsuit to take mifepristone off the market, claiming it is harmful. The lawsuit also claims the FDA violated the 1873 Comstock Act by letting patients get mifepristone through the mail. If the court finds the Comstock Act was violated, it will have repercussions beyond mifepristone.
And the important thing to remember about the Comstock Act is that it's not just abortion medication that would be impacted, but the tools that you use for a procedural abortion. And so that would be illegal as well. And so all of a sudden, New York abortion providers can't have their tools shipped to them. That would be illegal.
National abortion ban. It's being discussed.
The GOP has put a national abortion ban on their bucket list. Such a ban would eliminate reproductive freedom for all women in every state, and put IVF on the chopping block, and ban the abortion drug mifepristone. The success the anti-choice side has had in the Supreme Court has emboldened them. Many believe they will set their sights on birth control next.
The attack on women's reproductive health and their ability to make decisions about their reproductive health is not just about abortions. It even boils down to contraception and whether or not women have access to contraception.
For centuries, women have been a force for change. In 1893, while fighting for the right to vote, Susan B. Anthony said, "Organize, agitate, and educate. That must be our war cry." It may be a different century, but for women, it's the same fight.
Imagine if every person that had an abortion was able to share that. I really believe that would be over.
There's only one thing we can do. It's vote. That's a 4-letter word, vote. And bring your friends.
You know, what I'm trying to do is make sure every woman knows that Donald Trump and his crowd don't care if she dies.
We need to elect champions for choice to the 500,000 elected seats in our government in this country. Everything from school boards to town councils to state legislatures to Congress and the White House. All of those seats. And that can only happen if you get politically active. Your vote, your willingness to work in campaigns, write postcards, make phone calls, knock on doors. The end of Roe is not the end of the story. To paraphrase Joan Baez, the best antidote to despair is action. And your action, your willingness to work hard, can not only preserve reproductive freedoms for ourselves, but for our children as well. So let's do it.